Tonight,
You spent your entire life digging up the past.
a CNC3 special.
When I saw my first relatives in India, I felt like running up and kissing the young man's hand.
His life's work has helped hundreds of East Indians encounter their family roots in India, connecting the past with the present. But why is it important? What can the past teach us that we don't already know? Now on CNC3, Genealogist Shamshu Deen.
Mr. Shamshu Deen, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here with you, one of
Absolutely.
my students.
Happy to have you.
Mm.
They say that you should leave the past in the past. You spent your entire life digging up the past. What has motivated you?
Well, first of all, I won't say that I'm my entire past because I do have many other interests, as you might recall. But what motivates me is that I find elders, especially long ago when I wasn't an elder myself, up to the present time, their stories are fascinating. As I would always say, their stories are different from what I read in books and so on. You know, it's a live story that's happening. And what's even better in scientific genealogy is that I get the opportunity, or I take the opportunity to prove what they're telling me, whether it's correct, whether it's mythical or not. You know, this is what I like about meeting old people and digging up the past, as you say.
When you look at the journey, you're 76 now. You've spent a large chunk of that 76 years helping East Indians and other ethnicities from Trinidad and Tobago retrace their steps back to their roots, whether it be in India, whether it be in Africa. As we near Indian Arrival Day, what has this journey meant to you?
Well, it has meant so much. And I'm glad that you included other groups, because I do work, maybe 75 to 90% of my work is with East Indians. But I do work with other groups as well. But many, many people want to know about their past, and so do I. The journey has meant giving me the opportunity of meeting so many people, you know, that I never dreamt about. I mean, teaching brought me close to a few people, quite a few people, I should say. Videotaping and photography and so on, those brought me. But genealogy has opened the world to me, because I do get requests from all over the world. You'll be surprised to know that Trinidad people are all over the world: Australia, Hong Kong, and North America is just like over the road from Trinidad now. You know, so from all over the world I get requests. So I have to make myself available at all kind of time zones. I do interviews sometimes at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know.
Given what you've spent most of your life doing, does Indian Arrival Day, and we are celebrating Indian Arrival Day, does it mean something a little bit more to you? Is it a little bit special to you than it is perhaps to the average person?
Well, I really can't compare myself with an average person, so to speak, because I think I'm an average person myself. But having done so many arrivals of different peoples, and though a lot of these arrivals tend to happen at around the same time, because of our journey was through Southern Africa to come to Trinidad, so we took advantage of the Southern Hemisphere summer. You know, and so we landed in Trinidad in the early parts of the year, you know, especially around March, April or so. But some were scattered throughout the year. And so Indian Arrival Day, May 31st, 30th, is very important, because that's when our first ship landed in Trinidad and so on. But in my case, Indian Arrival has to spread throughout the year, you know, because I have several lineages and we celebrate our different arrivals, you know, of our ancestors. And that takes place during the course of the year, not just in May.
You know, you've spent such a long time, you know, helping people get back to their family roots in India. Why has it been so important, and why is it so important, do you feel, for people to want, the need to find their family roots back in India?
Okay, there are many reasons. First of all, sentimental. A lot of people, you know, just the idea of it. There's a curiosity of knowing, well, where did I come from? And that means my ancestors and my roots. So that's one side of it. But then Also, there are medical reasons as well. When we examine, everybody is getting health conscious now, which is very good. But we know that a lot of diseases are preventable, but some are genetically got obtained from our ancestors. So if we look at things like the death registers and so on, we see causes of death, and if we know that something runs in our family, heart, cancer, whatsoever, we do things to prevent that. But then too, also there are religious reasons. Many people go to India for temples and mosques and so on, to feel restored in their religion. And the mere idea of meeting relatives is another important thing. Some people say just to get to that village where my ancestors came from would be very important. So there are so many reasons. And also there's a financial reason in a way, because India has been given something called the Overseas Indian Certificate, Citizen Card, Overseas Indian Certificate, Overseas Citizen of India card, it's called. So a lot of people want to get that because they get certain privileges in India as well. So there are many reasons why people want to get back to their Indian roots.
Interesting. How rigorous, though, is the process for someone like you, a genealogist like you, to help someone from the very start, from the very scratch, to get back to, the past?
Well, I make it rigorous in the sense that, first of all, I want to hear what you know. Let's say you approach me. I want to know what you know. And okay, you might have heard things, and it might, over the generations, it might, like a game of charades, by the time you get to the third or fourth source, it starts to change, So, it's very similar with us through the generations. So first of all, I want to know what you know, but I want you to lead me on to your ancestors, to your elders. I won't say ancestors because I don't think any of us are lucky right now to have an Indian ancestor through the indentureship system. We don't seem to have that anymore because I worked with the last set of survivors of indentureship. If we have any now, they will have to be about 105 years old or 106 years old and more, and having been born on the last boat coming, so it's very hard to get somebody to give you something of the indentured times. So all of these factors are important in looking at what we're trying to do.
Given that factor that you just said, is it making your work a little bit harder now, given that that generation that you speak of, who would have been 105, 106 years by now, are sort of no longer with us?
Yes, you're quite correct, because the scenario was much easier 20, 30 years ago, because people remembered, and there were people alive who could tell us what we want to know, about how they came. Because knowing one name alone is not, if we get back to that point of being rigorous, knowing one name is not important, is good, but it's not enough, because so many people came with the same name and with one name only. So you will find 300 Ramlals coming. And I want to suspect that about 100 and more Bechus came as well.
Right.
So you have to make sure. So we look at things like age appropriate. It must be, I can't bring you somebody who's your ancestor and then find out that your first Trinidad ancestor was born in 1910, and I bring you somebody in 1917, let's say. So, it doesn't make sense that way. So there are all kinds of rigors we tried. And one of the best rigors we get is through the documentation. You see, people had a lot of stories to tell. And I have seen a lot of stories, sadly, where people have written things down. And when I get to the documentation, it doesn't mesh at all. And they write it in great authority. So it saddens me because, the people, I have to tell people that what your dear uncle or your dear grandfather has written is not correct, because it doesn't mesh with the documentation. The documentation is showing us something different.
How long does it take you to retrace someone's past?
Well, it depends on how much you know, and how a few things that help quite a lot would be like if your ancestor came accompanied. So if that same Ramlal came with a wife named Savitri and a child named Babulal, let's say. So you're looking for 3 people then. And so that makes it much easier. So when you find your Ramlals, your different Ramlals, you will look to see if that configuration exists in the documentation. That is very important, that configuration of ideas or of principles, of things that people bring to the table for me. All of those things would be very, very, very helpful. So that's where the rigors would come in.
I imagine that, I know that while you said that a lot of the past elders who would have been 105, 106 have now left us, has technology made your work, though, easier?
Very good point. And it has done so because of the rapidity with which you can get to the names. You can get things, if you digitize and so on, you can get things easier if you computerize. So really, a very important branch of scientific genealogy is its work with the computers. And I think nearly every field, really, whether it's in history or literature or especially the sciences, you find that people will be using computers a lot more, building databases, building all kinds of systems whereby you can rush to a name very quickly.
Still to come, across oceans and across time, Shamshu Deen reaches to the root of the family tree. What is that moment like when the present meets the past?
When you started this work many years ago, it became very popular very fast. And while 75 to 90% of your clients were East Indians, other descents, other ethnicities in Trinidad and Tobago quickly caught on. And you've managed to help a few Africans, Chinese, Syrians also try to retrace their past.
Yes, you're quite correct. Portuguese as well, because I'm going to give you a Portuguese example as well in this, because the BBC had contacted me a few years ago, maybe about 20 years ago, about one of their announcers in England who said that she had Trinidad Portuguese roots, and they asked me to prove that for them. Well, luckily I had learned something which applies to all groups. Like, for example, it's nice to know these little tidbits here and there. Like, I knew that from 1891, the death registers in Trinidad contained the country of origin of the country of birth of the deceased person. And that's a very important point, because I had used that they wanted to prove how could you say that this lady's grandfather had Portuguese origin. Well, I went and looked for his birth, and I didn't find anything in it. But when I looked for a sibling of his, I found that the sibling's birth was registered by his grandmother, and the grandmother had a Portuguese name. So that was not enough. I tracked the grandmother's death, because that was in 1891 or sometime. So I tracked, I said, listen, lady, you are old. You're not going to last too long again. Maybe it's not a good thing to say. But I tracked, and she lasted until 1923. And when I found her there, I found her dying in 1923. Her country of origin was Portugal. So the BBC was so happy with that. They could have done, they proved what she was saying, what the announcer was saying. So there are certain things in the Registrar General's office that unfortunately we're not allowed to use anymore. I used to be able to use it before, but now they have put clamps and so on, and people can't get in there. But there are so many things in the marriage and the death and the birth registers that are so helpful to us in genealogy that we are not getting access to it. So that's one of my popular problems that I talk about now, Yeah.
You've reunited so many people in this country with their family roots. What is that moment like when the present meets the past?
Well, it's truly amazing in my own personal case to meet my relatives. You don't really meet your ancestors anymore, but you meet your present day relatives. So is that whether it's in Trinidad or whether it's in India or many other places in the world, you can go sometimes and meet your relatives. But that's a very, very touching moment. In my case, I mentioned that sometimes when I saw my first, relatives in India, I felt like running up and kissing the young man's hand, because he was working in a mill producing saris and carpets and so on, and his hand was all covered in red dye. And he was sitting in this hole in the floor, and I wanted to go and do that. But as a 50-year-old man at the time, I felt that wouldn't be right. but maybe I should have done it,
You've
But
also helped.
yes, so, sorry.
You've also helped two prime ministers.
Yes, that is well known as well. Both Kamla Prasad and Basdev Pandey. I was so fortunate in the case of Mr. Pandey. A few things happened in Mr. Pandey's visit that I still can't. It has to deal with some kind of karma or something, because I was given a scholarship to go to India when I finished my first book in '94. The scholarship came up in '96, and that was the same time, early '97, the scholarship had gone over to, when Mr. Pandey was given an invitation to attend the Republic Day celebrations in January of 1997. And I was given my scholarship in August of 1996 for 6 months. So that was going to be around February, it was going to finish. And so I went and I searched, because before researching India, I would have to say that, well, maybe more now, but at that time, about 99% of the people couldn't say where they came from in India. What was their village? Of the 600,000 villages in India, people can't say where they came from. So in the case of Mr. Pandey, I had worked well close with his brother, who was at St. Stephen's College when I did my first teaching appointment there. He was about my age, actually, because I was teaching since I was 19, just with A-levels. And he met me when they became government at the end of '95. And he asked me to check what about his family, because I was into it already. So I searched out, I got the documentation. And so when the Indian government gave me the scholarship, I put that down as one of the 20 that I will attempt.
Wow.
And we got through that. And Mr. Pandey, he had heard about it, because the High Commissioner in India, when I told him what I had found, he said, well, you write Mr. Pandey. So I wrote him, and he said he told the government of India he wanted to go to his village. And it was such a great experience to see that on a cold January morning, because it's cold in India at that time of the year. And it was all misty and everything. And there comes the two or three helicopters coming down from the sky to that village, and the 40,000 people or so who they say were there, because people from all the neighboring villages, and if India has nothing, it has people there. People coming. They had to put big fences all around, and to see all of them come, and the Prime Minister meeting his family and all of that. And the same in the case of Kamla Prasad Bisesa. Apparently they said about 100,000, but I can't estimate, but crowd estimates say that. But I knew it was huge, yeah.
Similar to former Prime Ministers Kamla Prasad Bisesa as well as Basdev Pandey, I imagine that every person that you have helped retrace their past back to their family roots has an interesting story, and you were on the BBC World Service very recently. Up to last week, you were on the BBC World Service. I must ask you to repeat, and I promised myself that I wouldn't ask you to repeat anything from the BBC World Service interview, but that favorite story of yours, out of the hundreds that you have helped, that one story really could make a movie.
Oh, yes, that one, every time I think about it, it's so amazing that when this was one of my survivors of indentureship. You see, I told you I worked with the last maybe 100 or so of survivors of indentureship. I hunted them all around. And this lady was telling me her story. And I was just sitting there, and then I realized what it, and she's so casually going about it. She said that her mother was married when she was only about 10 or 12 years old. And then she had to go back to her mother's house, a process called, in India, it's called Gauna. Gauna meaning the village. So she went back to her mother's house. And when she was about 15, 16 or so, she came to her husband and was with her husband for about a week. And then he disappeared. Suddenly they couldn't find him at all. So they started to blame her, and they say, well, especially the mother-in-law and so on would say, well, what happened? My son was here with me for all these 20 years or so, and you come and suddenly he's gone. You are the cause of this. What have you done to him? So she said, I don't know. I didn't do anything. I don't know where he is. So they looked all over and they didn't find him at all. They didn't know where he went. And then she realized that having spent a week with her husband, she was pregnant. After about a few weeks or so, she realized this, and they said, that couldn't be our child, that you came here pregnant. And so she said, no, nobody ever touched me before. And so when the baby was born, they couldn't doubt it because the baby looked just like the father. Didn't look like the mother too much. But still, the abuse continued and so on for about 3 years or so. And then she decided she couldn't take it anymore. She just took her child and she said she's going to her mother's house. But her mother lived miles and miles away, maybe almost 100 miles away. And she didn't know how to get there. But while she was going, she was talking to the child, and so on, and people listening, because that was the job of the recruiters, and to find that weak moment in people. And then one of the recruiters came in without her knowing who he was and said, I would help you. I could take you to your mother's house, but I have to take you to a place. I'll take you first to a place where you'll make a lot of money and so on. Just sift some sugar and you'll make money, and then you can go to your mother's house. And next thing, she was on a boat to Trinidad. And on the boat, a lot of men were proposing to her. A lot of young men and older men and so on were telling her, well, listen, they knew the conditions in Trinidad, many of them, that there were not too many women, there were more men. The proportion was very high. And they were telling her, well, we will marry you and we'll look after your child. She said, no. I have a husband already, So not knowing. And she came to Trinidad, and they put her at an estate in Sandy Grande, where a cocoa estate, where there were snakes and scorpions and so on, no sugar at all, no sugar cane at all up there. So she cried and cried for a couple of years, and then a friendly overseer said, okay, well, look, I will get you transferred, which was a process that was done. And they transferred her to Caroni Estate. And while she was there, the little children had to stay by themselves, and while the elders went in the fields. And the little girl, about 5 years old now, fell and got a cut on her leg. And the children were all screaming and crying and knowing not what to do. And a young man who was going to the mill, every estate had its little mill before grinding the sugar. He heard the sound, the commotion, and he came and he attended to her, put some tobacco in the wound and wrapped it up, and put her in a bed and so on, a katia in those days. And when the mother came home in the evening and heard the problem, she cried and all of that, and then she decided to go and thank the man. And the man turned out to be her husband, the child's father.
I'm surprised you haven't
Amazing.
put that in a movie as yet.
Yes. Well, it's in a play, a play written by Victor Edwards, and it has been shown about 5 times, I think, at least. It's staged about 5 times so far.
When we come back, Shamshu Deen's other passion and how teaching complemented his work in genealogy.
Teaching helped me to do things I never thought I would be able to do. Genealogy was one of them, definitely.
This trade that you're in, genealogy, traces back hundreds, if not thousands of years. This is an incredibly historical trade that you are in. How has it evolutionized into what it is today, into how you practice it today?
Yes, evolution of genealogy is fascinating by itself. When it first started, people used to say they descended from the gods, especially the upper echelons in society, the kings and so on. They say that they came. Julius Caesar said he came from the goddess Aphrodite, all of that. So these kinds of myths and so on continued, and then the other people in the society started to say, well, they were descended also from royalty or from nobility, especially in Europe. But over the years, people started to say, these things, these myths and so on don't make sense. And then some very important events happened to help genealogy, especially in a place like England, with the Domesday Book in 1088 by William the Conqueror. He had said that a survey has to be done in England, so everybody must give their name to their titles to get the titles of land that they had. So that was one point at which people could trace back to an ancestor, the ownership of land at that time. But then throughout the years, with immigration coming, people going to the different colonies, like in Australia and New Zealand, North America, the Caribbean, people in these areas started to clamor in England for documents to be saved, But England was a very documented society. They wanted to make sure that those documents were not destroyed, these colonials. colonists. They wanted to make sure that these documents were not destroyed. So these things happened. So over the years, this happened. So all kinds of genealogical societies and so on were opened up in many parts of the world, in Europe, North America, and so on, trying to save documentation because they knew that by the process of documentation, your genealogy becomes more scientific. And within the last few decades, DNA has entered into the picture now so that people can check out to see whether, I myself did my DNA to find that 98% of me comes from India, but I have a 2% which is broken between China and Vietnam.
Interesting.
So that was very surprising for me. Yeah.
Mr. Deen, you were, as you mentioned yourself, you have several other interests above and beyond genealogy. Your main profession at one point was a teacher. You were my geography teacher, so many others. How did teaching as a profession help the craft that you're in?
Oh, I would say it helped tremendously. It helped in many ways because at Cohen-Hamilton, where our paths crossed, so to speak, we were there. I was there for 25 years. You were there for only maybe 5 or 6 years, So I was there for a long time. But I found that Cohen-Hamilton was such an exciting place to be. First of all, it's a country school. And it gives you, in the case of astronomy, it gives me the sky on dark nights. So I had many, many viewing sessions. Luckily, I had brought a telescope. I always had a telescope since my first salaried occupation, which was a teacher in St. Stephenson way back in 1965. But yeah, so teaching helped me to formulate things. Like I in my classroom in social studies, family history became an important part of it. I also had clubs at the school. I had something called a local research club, whereby we would trace family histories and so on. And then it kind of peaked in 1993 when we entered and won $15,000 for the school in the Young Leaders Project. I was given $1,500 myself for running the project, which I was lucky to get at that time. But we had the students and teachers and members of the board and members of the public, of the school board that was, and the public also, join in the whole thing. And we were able to create about nearly 300 family trees, which we kept on file at Cohen-Hamilton. People were tracing their families. One of the things it brought out, and I never thought of some of the advantages, is that in many homes, as you will know, there are sometimes these little what Indian people call kuchur, where people, their father and mother, their parents are not talking sometimes to the grandparents for whatever reason. I don't want to get into that. But the child at Cohen-Hamilton insisted that, Mommy, you have to take me to Grandma and Grandpa because the project I'm doing, you can't help me enough. I need to get Grandpa's help. And if they were lucky, sometimes great-grandparents are alive still. So they took them there, and many enmities were crushed in that way. People got back together. Right. And so there were many advantages of those projects. So teaching helped me to do things I never thought I would be able to do. Genealogy was one of them, definitely.
Mr. Deen, after all these years, what has it been like for you to connect the past with the present?
Well, I would always say that every time, one thing I try not to do is to get to people and say, look, I want to do your genealogy. I try not to do that. I only did that with the survivors of indentureship. Those were the only ones because they were so precious. I didn't want them to go away without giving the valuable information that they would have. But I try my best not to get into people's past without being invited. But once you invite me, I am all crazy. Everything just lights up, and up to this moment at 76 years of age, as soon as somebody comes to me, I'm all excited to know your past. You just have to show me a little interest, and there I go. I get lost in your family, and every new person I meet coming with this is the most exciting of all. That becomes the most exciting on my table. Whoever comes to me right away, that's the one I want to do most.
You've never gotten tired of it.
No, not as yet. Not as yet. I haven't seen a boring moment in it as yet. It's frustrating sometimes when I can't get through. I feel so badly for the people that I can't work out because, as I said before, maybe it's my inability, maybe it's the memories are not there, the memories, but I still try without the memories. There are methods that I have learned over the past to how to connect, how to connect with the past, but sometimes it's difficult. Yeah.
Mr. Shamshu Deen, sir, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Byron. It's nice to see you again, and I must congratulate you on the wonderful job you are doing on CNC3.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dean. I appreciate it.